Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Barbara Mistick, president of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, to discuss the state of private higher education in the United States. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of ABHE, and we are honored. I've been really looking forward to this particular episode as we have Barbara Mistick, president of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, known as NAICU in Washington, D.C., a critical partner for a number of private institutions generally, but then also specifically our ABHE institutions. And before we just jump into it, I just want to say thank you on behalf of our 162 members, Barbara, for your work, your team's work in DC. I just can't. I know enough to know that your life is very challenging as you navigate through everything that's happening, not only at the federal level, but also at the state levels as you're working with a number of the state agencies, working with independent colleges. So on behalf of all of us, I just want to say thank you for your work. It certainly doesn't go unnoticed. But I've brought Barbara in to talk about what she sees as challenges and opportunities facing private higher education. It should be a wonderful conversation, particularly in our political context that we find ourselves in the summer of 2024. So, Barbara, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you for the partnership with ABHE. It's really been so critical to us at NICU to have you and your members be a part of our community. This work is absolutely collective action, and we couldn't make it happen without you. So thanks.
Thank you. So we have a series of questions that we're going to kind of walk through and just have a conversation on. We could probably spend the entire episode on what your thoughts are on our political environment right now, but we're just going to skip over that piece of it for now, and we'll get into some specific questions. But before we do, just so our audience can get to know you a little bit, share with us a defining moment as you reflect back over your life. What's a defining moment that has kind of propelled you forward to where you find yourself now as president of NICU in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I have to say that this might sound a little trite representing colleges and universities, but really the most defining moment for me was getting a bachelor's degree.
Hmm.
And I was the first in my family to get a
Oh.
college education. And my college education was interrupted. My dad was a small business owner and he got sick, and I was in undergrad, and I left and went home to help out in the family business, which is what so many of our students do, and I did it too. And it was, several years before I went back and completed my bachelor's degree. And then, fast forward through two more degrees. And when I remember when I was being installed at Wilson, my dad was,
Hmm.
thank goodness, was still alive, and he was sitting in the front
Hmm.
row, and the tears were just
Oh,
coming down his face. And I just thought, it's just an amazing testament to the
yeah.
American dream to have gone from, my dad who went straight from high school,
Hmm.
enlisted when Pearl Harbor happened, went straight into the army,
Hmm.
came back and started a business. I mean, just to go from that dynamic
Yeah.
to where I am today, it was totally something I didn't see, didn't understand that was possible until after I had gotten my degree and gotten started.
Yeah, I think we take a lot of that for granted in the United States, our access to higher education and really the flexibility, because that even goes back some time of you dropping out and then re-enrolling, the flexibility of colleges to stop out and be able to help at home and then come back. It's neat how that actually shaped you for what you're doing today, because one of the things about NICU is making sure that students have great access to our private institutions. And you sharing about your dad, that's a great story. I'm sure you have that like frozen in your mind, right? When you were installed as a president, to see him there and how proud he must have been of you at that point. So
Yeah,
thanks for sharing that. And you're from Pittsburgh, right?
that's right. That's right.
We're not going to hold that against you having grown up in Philadelphia. Uh, as you're
I
probably a
think I got
Steelers fan or
acquainted with you when I was in Central Pennsylvania, and, Lancaster Bible College was in my athletic conference,
you
and
got it.
so I got to know, Peter, who was, president there at the
Yeah.
time, and then subsequently got to know you, Phil,
Yeah.
so, yeah,
Yep.
it's
Yep.
been Pennsylvania does, connect us even though I won't hold it against you that you're from
Thank you.
Philadelphia.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we'll just put all that aside and we'll just go right into our questions. How about that? So, you have led NAICU so incredibly well, and I've had an opportunity to watch you both from your experiences at Wilson, but then also being now in this position with just a great team that you've assembled around you. And the work that they do is amazing, especially when you came in and it was COVID. There were government shutdowns. There were budget cuts along the way. We've just gone through some crazy time with the Department of Education and the financial aid issues of the FAFSA. And so pull back from all of that and let's look at the bigger picture of private higher education in the US. Talk to us. What would you say are some of the challenges, top three challenges that we're facing? And then we, like you, we're optimists. The glass is always half full. Let's talk about what some three challenges are, but then what are some top opportunities that we have in front of us?
Well, Phil, you mentioned COVID and coming in at that time period. It was interesting to me because during the whole COVID period, on the congressional side, on the federal side, people really wanted to be helpful. They
Yeah.
were very concerned about the future for higher education. They wanted to make sure our institutions stayed viable. I don't know if you remember the first stimulus round, they were not going to include private
Mhm.
nonprofits. And
Right.
then when the Biden administration started, that happened all over again, but each time we were able to, to make sure that we were included to preserve keeping the whole sector, the whole
Hmm.
ecosystem together, really because of the advocacy of our membership.
Yeah.
But so we went from Congress being helpful to now all of this regulatory pressure. So I have seen just a
Mm.
tremendous shift. And so now you really are looking at, Congress moving from wanting to help us, help students, help them afford, stay in school, all of those other things to what more can we regulate on your
Mhm.
campus? And so that's just been I think that's a huge shift and a challenge for us
Mhm.
because we are certainly a highly regulated industry. Just look at the things that are in place, the things that have been added. And when you are in a highly regulated industry, it seems to come with this dynamic of tight margins. And
Mhm.
so if you look at what happened with FAFSA, I'd say that's the second challenge there. You're looking at the government controlling the student aid that goes to students, and you're looking at this total debacle of the system. So whatever good was done by
Yeah.
Congress during the COVID period, now all of a sudden we're sitting here with the whole FAFSA and not knowing what our enrollment's going to be.
Yeah.
So and there was such a shift there to put responsibility on our institutions to explain to families. So I think that's been a challenge. I'd like to say that challenge is over, but I worry that that's gonna continue into the next enrollment.
Just curious before you continue with the challenges, I just want to stay on this for a little bit. The drivers to the over regulatory environment, rarely do we go backwards. It's pretty much always layering and
Yeah.
adding on to it. Is it as simple as the public's demand and expectation of, okay, well, if college expenses are this high, then our expectation is that we regulate and make sure that colleges are so like what's why all the regulation?
Well, I think part of it is about debt, as you've seen during this
Yeah.
last cycle. So there's been all of this conversation about how much debt is for families and how it's hurting certain families, particularly those that have some college but no degree but have
Hmm.
debt left. And
Yeah.
then we've seen this ballooning of debt. So debt now far, far eclipses what the Department of Ed spends on an annual basis.
Wow.
So, I think that's put this spotlight on affordability,
Yeah.
and that spotlight on affordability has led to this desire to regulate, and that those things kind of come together. And then, of course, there's been the challenges of some of the things that the Biden administration's tried to do on debt forgiveness,
Yeah.
and Congress hasn't been happy about that. So they want to figure out how to make this more affordable. And then you're dealing with, 435 members who don't understand our business model and
Right.
don't
Right.
understand what's happening in communities. So I think, that it's actually a nice segue, back to the challenges, because I do think that the narrative that's out there today is not reflective of the reality.
Mhm.
It's not reflective of how valuable the college education is to the students that we serve, how it changes their lives. Just
Mhm.
as we were talking about at the top of this conversation. And so, it leaves a lot of work for us to
Yeah.
do to have Congress understand that and have the administration understand the impact of all the regulation.
Yeah, yeah, and I've been in plenty of situations and observe it that, the overregulation, not only at the federal level, but state level
Yeah.
and local levels too, that it can take you off mission. It can discourage
Yes.
because you're adding personnel, you're adding resource to just simply respond, and it begs the question of what are we producing all of this information for?
Right.
And it can be a discouragement to our institutions, as it's the necessary stuff that they have to do in order to stay true to their mission, which is what drew all of us to higher education in the first place, right?
Exactly.
But it gets a little muddy when you add in all of that. So now I'm super discouraged. So let's flip over. What are those opportunities that you see out in front of us as a in our sector?
Well, given all the challenges that are there, the real opportunity is leadership. I think that would be number one on my list. I constantly, when I'm on the road or meeting with, your members or other state associations and so on, I great leaders stepping in and doing very creative
Yeah,
things. It
yeah.
it just totally impresses me. And I think that, we have to keep a focus on that. I see
Hmm.
people starting programs that are looking at nuclear medicine in your sector and
Hmm.
who are doing just really creative, innovative things that are going to balance out the margins and the difficulty. So I,
Hmm.
I think that we have to keep sight of that, of how much innovation exists within higher education. I know we often talk about the reluctance to change, but I
Yeah.
honestly see the flip side of that. And I do think there are mechanisms in place that are opportunities for us to say, we care too. We don't need to be regulated to in order to care, but we embraced a program called the College Cost Transparency
Hmm.
Initiative earlier this year, where institutions would agree that they would make a fully transparent process in the admissions cycle. So I
Hmm.
think there are ways for us to partner and be supportive of some of the challenges that are coming at us as well.
Mhm, mhm. That's great insight, and it kinda goes to the second question I wanna ask you, because learned early on in my leadership career to not burn bridges, right? And you're living that, right? So you're in Washington, DC, you're negotiating, you wanna show good faith effort, to these regulatory bodies that, "Look, we're happy to respond to these, but we wanna help you understand who we are and how can we, compromise and work together with this." So you're very big, and I think this is something that has been in NAICU's DNA, but you have really done a fabulous job of moving this forward, is building relationships with local, state, federal government representatives. So I know the obvious answer to, is there a value in doing those things? The obvious answer is yes, but go deeper for us. Why is it so important for our college presidents, particularly, but the entire institution, everybody in the institution, to build those relationships with federal, state, local government representatives?
Well, first of all, Phil, we can't do this work without your members. We
Mm,
do this work because we have your members who represent their institutions and their home communities.
mhm,
And that really makes a difference. When our federal lawmakers are considering legislation or policy or regulations, we really want them to understand the unintended consequences on institutions that are in their district. That is
mhm.
so critical, particularly today. We were just talking about the narrative. We don't want them to be thinking about Harvard or Penn.
Yeah,
We want them to be thinking about your institutions, whether
yeah.
it's Appalachian Bible College or anyone else. That's who we want them to have in their mind, is the
Mhm,
home institution. And I think the federal government's probably your largest single donor. So I
Mhm.
was doing some prep for a presentation next week and looking at the average percentage of income that comes to institutions from federal sources. So
Mm.
all of your Pell grants, your federal work study, your SEOG grants, if you're getting any other kind of Title IV funding into your institution, all of that, when you add it together, it's going to be somewhere around, I don't know, the ones I was looking at last week were 33 to 50% of
Mm.
the budget dollars that come into your institution each
Yeah.
year. Because add to that 33% or so the state contribution if you have a state grant program. So you're looking at usually close to 50% of your cash flow is coming from either federal or state sources. So
Mhm.
you really want to know what's going on, what
Yep.
impact that's going to have on your institution, particularly if you've got tight margins. It's really critically important to understand that. But it's also critically important to be an advocate for higher education
Yeah.
policy. And
Right.
I think that's the piece that it's presidents have so many things to do, and you want to know your community, and that's all important. But today we were just talking about affordability and how to make the American dream possible. So federal work study this past year, Congress wanted to zero that out. We only got it back in again because of all of the advocacy that our collective
Mhm.
community did. That's really what makes the difference. I mean, we can work with offices in DC, but when your member calls their member in their district, that's
Yep.
what really makes a difference. We've had this recent work on the Pell Grant maximum. That's really made a difference. Over the last Congress, the $900 increase in Pell equates to $2 billion
Hmm.
in student aid to just private nonprofit institutions, just
Wow.
our part of the sector.
Yeah.
So that's really, that's huge. So I think that building those relationships is absolutely critical. It's critical not just to your institution, but it's critical to your students and the families that you be an advocate for them. And then it's critical to the rest of your peers
Mhm.
in our ecosystem. I think that's what I believe in, fundamentally, that we're better for the diversity that's
Yeah.
within our ecosystem.
And that's what I so appreciate about NAICU is valuing that diversity to say, look, everyone's not in agreement on all issues, but that's not the point. What we are together on is the independence and the value for us to be able to operate according to our convictions, according to our missions, according to and to protect that because we are better in that diversity. And you didn't ask me to do this, and I'll just do it right now. I'll put a plug in for sure for NICU. If there's obviously all kinds of organizations that our colleges and universities can join, I put NICU at the top of the list. Just the resources that you provide and the access, and you're yes, you do a lot of work in Washington D.C., but you're dependent on our colleges and universities reaching out to their federal, state, local government officials to tell the story, to tell the narrative, because so often it's not that they're necessarily opposed to your institution; it's that they're ignorant. They don't know how certain legislations or how something in Washington D.C. trickles down to the actual college or university. So it's almost like an informative piece of it. What do you tell people? And I get this question often because we're blue states, red states, politics enters this thing. What do you tell some of our presidents who politically are just not aligned with their state representatives or senators? What they've told me is it's not even worth them knowing who we are or telling our story. What do you tell those institutions when you hear that response?
Well, of course, Phil, I would totally disagree that it's worth knowing your institution because you're an intellectual leader in your community or a civic leader in your community, that your elected officials need to know what you're doing. And
Yeah,
so I think at the heart of the work that we do, we are educators. That's
yeah,
how most of us came into higher education, is through teaching in some capacity. So we can't, we're not going to like everybody that's in
yeah,
our classroom, right? And we're not going to
right.
like every legislator that we need to understand our sector and understand the impact of our institution. So what I ask people is to really put that aside
Mhm.
and think of the federal government as your largest donor. And you might not like all of your donors, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you don't keep them informed about what you're doing, that you
Yeah.
don't take opportunities to, just as you said, tell the story, have
Mhm.
them know the student stories. I think I've often said, and I believe this to my core, that you can't go wrong by putting students first. So if you put a student's story first, it's really going to resonate with your elected official. And if you can't move the bar with them, at least you've tried, and
Yep.
keep trying.
Yep.
Write them, invite them to campus events. I think that's all critically important.
And finding common ground. The tendency is to make the assumption when we're not politically, ideologically aligned with our representative or our senator that on all issues there's going to be disagreement. That's not necessarily the case, especially since they're representing the state from which your institution exists. They need to know. I mean, they have multiple industries that they have to represent, and for them to tell the story. And you're exactly right. Telling student stories is the most powerful thing, because how do you counter somebody's personal testimony of how their life was changed, how they've grown and gotten a job, or if in our sector they're in ministry context, giving back to the community through the church. There are just so many positive stories to tell, and you all do such a great job of providing us resources, how to approach, how to couch that message, how to be focused in what you're talking about to a senator or to a representative. Definitely, I would encourage folks to be a part of that. So recently, and I think this was a Barna study. I could be wrong on this because I think they've been doing this every year. Correct me if you know it to be different. They do an annual study on the public opinion of America on higher education, and it's a pretty simple question: are you positive or negative towards it? And this year or last year was the first year that we kind of tipped the scales, where it was always positive until last year. What's driving that?
Well, I think the key driver of this narrative is this misconception
Yeah.
that college isn't worth it. And what we know is that higher education might not be the answer for everyone or for every career, but it's critically important to our economy, to our workforce. It's also just incredibly important to families. It is the generational change that comes from access to higher education is just tremendous. And we know that working with employers, there are a lot of states that have completion goals because they know the industries coming in are requiring college degrees. So, I think it's just totally understanding the background of
Hmm.
why it is worthwhile and being able to talk about that to your families. I think that is a very important aspect of what each and every president should be able to do. But overall, public trust in all national institutions has decreased over the
Yeah.
years. So you've been hearing about it this year, relative to both the Congress and the number
Hmm.
of speakers of the House that we had this past year. So, there is all of this dynamic going on. And every time there's noise, it does filter out into the public.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of noise because of the campus unrest.
Hmm.
And while that might not be true for your member institutions, it does get seeded in the public view.
Hmm.
One of the positives that I've seen lately, a kind of a counter to the poll that you mentioned, is the June Gallup poll that came out, looked at the confidence level of American institutions, and it ranked higher ed fourth. It put
Okay.
us behind small business, the military, and the police.
Huh.
So I think that says that, there's people are listening
Hmm.
despite this overwhelming sense of, is it worth it? So
Yeah.
I think we can't give up on continuing to talk about that and
Yep.
continuing to tell the story about why it's worth it and to share those student stories. I think that's critical.
Yeah. And that's I refer to it when I talk about it as kind of the trickle down effect, that whatever happens at the national scene in a congressional hearing, Harvard, Penn, whoever, and the public sees that as a headline, a 10-second headline, and now that's the label for all of higher education, which simply is not true. And yet we're guilty by association because we're in the industry, which I think means all the more that our colleges do need to tell the positive story of the impact that they're having in the communities and how they are, not what the public or what the media wants you to think higher education is. Not all of us cost $100,000 a year, right? Uh,
Exactly.
in fact, no one does except for one or two schools. So there's a bit of an adjustment, but we can't ignore that. We've got to address it. All right, so I'm going to have you put your prognosticator hat on. Being from Pennsylvania, we're used to that about winter and spring and all of that. So, what do the next 10 years look like if you were to zoom ahead in a time machine and you're looking at the sector of higher education in 10 years, private higher education? What does it look like?
Well, number one thing I'd say is no Groundhog Days. I don't want to go back to
I'm
the
with you.
to the
Uh,
pandemic or
no,
even to
no.
this FAFSA
Yeah,
debacle that's underway right now.
yeah,
But I think our ecosystem is so diverse,
yeah,
and that is so important to our nation that I see that continuing. And I
yeah,
think that preserving all the work that we're doing to preserve private nonprofit institutions is critically
yeah,
important because we can't end up with just a public higher education system. It would not serve the needs of all of the learners that are out there in the communities that we're in.
yeah,
I think the key way to have us stay viable is to make sure that some of the barriers to access,
yeah.
which have truly barely moved the needle
Mhm.
on in the last, in the last decade or so. But together, I really believe that we have the opportunity to have debt-free undergraduate
Yeah,
education. Because
yeah.
if you look at the average debt levels at the undergraduate level, I'm not going to talk about graduate debt, which is really the part
Mhm.
that's driving the debt conversation today. I think that we can create a network where students can come for the undergraduate experience. Of course,
Mhm.
part of that, I believe, would be doubling the Pell Grant, which we've been working on. So that serves students in every single sector. So
Yeah,
that could be a key piece. Getting that in place along with the state grants that are in many states, I think we could have a debt free tuition
mhm.
for undergraduates. I really
Yeah,
believe that. What I worry about on the other side of that, if you're looking at those barriers to access, the living on campus part of it,
mhm.
I find it fascinating that today only about 15% of students live on campus. And
Hmm.
that's such a critical part of the
Yeah,
undergraduate experience.
yeah.
So, I worry about shifting from tuition to
Mhm.
the residential costs because we know they're all part of our business model and what impact that could potentially have. But
Yeah.
overall, I believe in our leadership and the creativity of
Mhm.
them. I think I think we could be in a very different place in 10 years.
Yep, yep. I think generally speaking, resiliency is becoming necessary in our sector. Those schools who are not able to be resilient are the ones that we're seeing close. Those who are able to adapt to the environment, because we do believe in the very core of what higher education does. And you can make a very strong argument that it's critical for the success of the United States. And to not have it or to generalize it or to not allow for that diversity makes us fundamentally a different country.
Yeah, I think you've seen that with the FAFSA
Yeah. Yeah.
problems. Leaving out if, whatever percentage of students it is at this moment when you're listening to this podcast that haven't completed the FAFSA application this year, leaving those students aside essentially creates a 50-year problem
Yeah.
because those students not coming
Yeah.
into our institutions, not graduating, they're not going into the workforce with a bachelor's degree, they're not going to enjoy the upside of earnings potential over time and the ability to save for retirement and so on. So that has a 50-year impact on our
Yep.
economy, what's happened this FAFSA cycle, this
Yep.
enrollment cycle. So if
Yep.
you think about that, that really tells you, how critically important our institutions are. And that doesn't even address the innovation that comes from our
Right.
institutions, the way that we're looking at research and coming up with new solutions. I mean, it's just
Mhm.
the importance of our sector is so great. That's
Yep.
a part of the reason why the noise about it is so
Yeah.
great too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Barbara, we have 1 minute left in our podcast. So you have an audience of leaders within biblical and Christian higher education listening. What's one last thought or challenge that you'd like to leave with them?
Well, Phil, I think your institutions have a distinct advantage right now, and that is because of the pastoral care that goes
Mm,
on at each and every one of your institutions.
mm.
We are certainly living in a moment in history where people feel unmoored. They feel that there's a great uncertainty out there, and they're looking for that kind of pastoral care. And your institutions are ideal to deliver that to students today.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Barbara, for joining us today. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your work. It's greatly appreciated, and just appreciate what you're doing. And a lot of us don't see everything that you're doing. So, on behalf of all of us, just thank you for your work.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks to your members. We appreciate their
Absolutely.
support.
And if you'd like more information about NAICU, in the show description, we'll put a link to NAICU's website where you can find out more information about what NAICU does, what resources they have, as well as membership information in case listening to this podcast, you want to consider joining NAICU. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.